Hello, everybody, and welcome to another installment of Chance Paladin Reads a Book that's the Pacific Northwest Affliction book to you. This book was read in front of a live streaming audience. It should not be considered medical, legal, dental, vision, or any other kind of advice or anything. It's just a book. I'm just an author, and you're just a book reader person. So, that being said, let's go. This is book number 9, also known as Antivirus. And it's book number 9. And it's a cybersecurity adventure. And all rights, here's the legalese. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without permission from the author, except as permitted by U.S. copyright law. This is a work of fiction. Named characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental. Content advisory is as follows. I write post-apocalyptic stories, therefore portions of these stories are intended for mature audiences. There's as much romance as you would expect in a typical post-apocalyptic scenario. Explicit sexual acts were included are germane to the story and not intended to be gratuitous or fetishized. There isn't really any hard swearing worse than what you hear on cable. And there's a moderate amount of range of violence as would be expected in a post-apocalyptic story. However, the suffering aspects are not deliberately glamorized or embellished upon. Alright. Forward. People die every day. It's an unfortunate part of reality, but when the collapse happens, a lot of people are going to die. We allowed society to get this way. The most obvious thing everyone should be storing extra of, medicine, is now even the hardest to get a hold of in any supply. It's a system we allowed to be put in place, and it will be the death of many of our loved ones, maybe even us. Maybe if we had taken as good a care as ourselves as we did our computers. Calm down, little ones. Class Stronghold, 3 years and 1 month after the collapse. The children were chanting again. Tell us another story, tell us another story. What story do you want to hear about this time? Some of the parents have been requesting that I tell the kids stories that were a little less violent. I thought I'd been doing a good job, but that's okay. At least it was some sort of feedback. Tell us something about how computers and the internet worked. Alright, I think I got something. Sure, I actually have the perfect story for that. The children calmed down with their snacks and blankets and got ready. Morton the Antivirus, cyberspace, days before the collapse, morning, day 1. It started a day like any other day. There hadn't been any patches to download overnight, and Morton was busy doing the scan he was supposed to do. He had his list from the day before, and he was diligently checking all the file sizes and what was in them to the day before. Morton noticed a few changes, but they were on his set of authorized changes for the cycle. It took him a little while to do his safety checks, but he eventually got it all done before the user would get there to use the machine again. Morton liked when his user started working because he could go back to his office and relax while the automated systems passively ran. Morton finished his comparisons, then went back to his office to formulate a report for the network's antivirus administrator. All of the reporting had to be done by a certain time so the antivirus administrator could report his aggregate findings to the network's superuser group. The antivirus administrator had all of the antiviruses running fairly strict routines, but it wasn't anything Morton couldn't handle. He wasn't currently living in the fastest hard drive available, but it was fast enough, he supposed. It was an old mechanical hard drive, but very reliable, probably outlived most of the solid-state drives at least. Of course, he would be replicated on another machine somewhere, but wouldn't remember any of this. That would be sad to him, so he wanted to keep his hard drive running as good as possible. Nothing was more rewarding, after all, than growing old with the computer you were first installed on. Morton diligently worked on his report for a little bit, which didn't take long. Once the report was complete and packaged up in the right protocol, he launched it over to the network to the task's administrator. Morton got a simple green light back and knew the process was complete. He didn't get much more of a response than that because he knew the task administrator was receiving hundreds of reports. It would be a lot of aggregating to do that was way beyond Morton's capacity. He tried not to think about it. Morton finally had a little while to rest in between having to send off his report, and when his user would want to get on the computer and start their day. He looked at all of his monitors and everything was running perfectly. There were no files misbehaving. He looked out his window at the wall, which was on fire, and it seemed to be functioning normally. The wall didn't report to Morton, obviously, but that didn't mean that Morton couldn't check up on its services to see how it was doing as he got time. Content that everything was as it should be, Morton powered down for a little bit to reduce the energy requirement for the computer he was running in. Had to try to be efficient, after all. Morton thought to himself, what if my user doesn't come in today? I wonder what I'll do. Morton pondered in the solitude of his subroutines. Maybe I'll work on my quarantines today, or something, Morton wondered about. Maybe there's something up on the internet how to finally clean them up. Morton wasn't supposed to go on the internet by himself, but got permission to from time to time. He was allowed on the Morton knowledge base, where he could talk to other programs over what they've experienced. It was all part of his information sharing process that the task administrator had opted all of them into. Morton wasn't supposed to go out very often, but he hadn't in a while, so it was probably okay. Maybe there's an update for me to read, Morton thought. Morton's systems powered up by itself, and he got a blinking urgent message. Morton sat up straight in his chair and opened the message right away, exactly like how he was instructed to. It read, "Urgent message about recent found exploit." Morton looked at who the email was from. It was an internal memo from external. It had been pre-scanned for him, so it was okay for him to read, so he opened it. Morton browsed through the email. Apparently on top of the giant gaping vulnerability they already had, a second one was newly discovered by the vendor. This, despite the vulnerability existing for the better half of 3 years. Morton reviewed the email several times, searching for the details on when he would get updated so he could assist with the new vulnerability. Patching with unplugging, plugging. But there was nothing. Morton recognized this as a Wi-Fi exploit and pressed the button on his console that looked like a radio tower. Morton couldn't really actually control the Wi-Fi, but he could watch things as they came in. Better than doing nothing, Morton supposed. He looked at the firmware version, and it hadn't been updated in forever. That was normal to Morton, because generally speaking, if the piece of hardware worked, the firmware could irreparably damage it. The update had to be mandatory and tested in an extremely controlled environment, otherwise it was a no-go. Morton had to update the firmware. Morton had no way to update the firmware either. All he could do was inspect the data once it came in. This made Morton frown. The wireless tower was going to let in whatever it thought it was supposed to let in, and there was nothing he could do about the event. Thankfully, he wasn't responsible for the other gigantic vulnerability that they had. It was all on one of the servers, and there was tons of redundancies protecting its public-facing layers now. The permanent fix was in development for his system, but no ETA. Morton knew everything coming in through the hardline would get taken care of. The wall that it had to go through was ridiculously over-engineered. There was a huge physical wall, then another dedicated electronic wall, and nothing ever got through. The radio tower, though, it wasn't nearly engineered as robust. Sure, it had 2-stage enterprise-level encryption, but it had to bounce around in the air multiple times. Radio technology had come a long way, and the core design had never been updated. Now it seems like they finally found an industry-wide failure point and released the framework to the public. Unfortunately, 3rd-gen wireless was too expensive. 2nd-gen had been secure for so long that this exploit had been largely ignored by the cybersecurity community. That's okay, Morton thought. I'll watch everything, especially coming in through the radio, and deal with it myself if I have to. Morton moved the urgent message into his saved documents so he'd remember to follow up with the task admin. However, that wouldn't be until the next day to see if he got a task set for them to get the promised fixed. He couldn't bug the task admin about it now because they'd be too busy. Plus, there were no engineers available to talk to the manufacturer anyway. Morton frowned again. The message sat in the saved box with his red exclamation point, and there was nothing he could do about it. Morton thought if he needed to reboot. Then he realized there hadn't been any system changes. He asked if any of the other security and preventative measures needed to reboot, and they all said no. With nothing left to do that hadn't already been addressed, Morton powered back down to save energy for the company. Morton dreamed a dream, not of electronic sheep, but a dream he'd had on a recurring basis, if you could call it a dream. It was something he thought about a lot. The radio tower was happily letting in bad data that was flying right over the fiery wall. It wasn't letting in a small amount of data, it was letting in a lot. The tower had become black and corrupted and wasn't listening to Morton's urgent pleas to temporarily shut down so Morton could keep up with the data reviews.